For 2 years, Maeve Calloway showed up at 6:45 every single morning before the cleaning crew finished, before the espresso machine was warm, before anyone in the building had any reason to be there at all. She did it because Ronan Dusk expected perfection, and perfection didn't happen by accident. She filed his contract. She remembered that he took his coffee black on Mondays but with a single shot of espresso added on Thursdays, because Thursdays were when he met with the Harrington Group, and those meetings ran long and ugly. She rerouted calls from journalists he didn't want to speak to. She fielded threats that came in disguised as routine business inquiries, and she learned slowly which ones to take seriously. She learned the shape of his silences. When he went quiet at a dinner table, it meant he was calculating something. When he went quiet on the phone, it meant someone on the other end had said something they shouldn't have. When he went quiet and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows of the 42nd floor office, she'd spent 2 years organizing into something functional and clean. That kind meant something else entirely, something she didn't let herself think about for too long. In 2 years, Ronan Dusk had never once looked at her the way he looked at those windows. She wasn't sure he'd really looked at her at all. There was a morning in early November when she spilled coffee on herself in the elevator. The whole cup, white blouse, and she had exactly 4 minutes before the day started. She kept a backup shirt in her bottom drawer. Second drawer from the left, she'd learned the hard way, and she changed in the small bathroom near the copy room and was back at her desk before anyone saw. Ronan walked past her station at 8:03, the way he did every morning. He didn't say good morning. He rarely did. He glanced at the stack of folders she'd flagged for his attention and picked up the first one without breaking stride. "Move the 10 o'clock to 11, he said. "Barton's stuck in traffic." "Already done," Maeve said. He paused, not long, half a beat. Then he kept walking. She told herself that was enough. That was what the job was. She was good at it, maybe the best assistant he'd ever had if the turnover rate of her predecessors meant anything, and she was paid well and the work was never boring, and that was supposed to be enough. It was enough. Most days it was enough. The thing about working for a man like Ronan Dusk was that you understood early what category you fell into. There were people he paid attention to. The ones who sat across from him at negotiating tables, the ones who controlled ports or politicians or both, and there were people who kept his world running. Maeve had known from the first week which side of that line she was on. She didn't resent it. That was the honest truth. She'd chosen this job with her eyes open, because she needed the salary, and because she was good at it, and because somewhere in the city there was a studio apartment with her name on the lease, and a stack of her mother's medical bills on the kitchen table that weren't going to sort themselves out. She kept her head down. She did her work. She didn't expect to be seen, and she wasn't. For 2 full years, she wasn't. The man's name was Ellis Ward, and he showed up on a Tuesday in late November to do a security audit of the building systems. He was tall, brown-haired, easy with a smile in the way that people are when they've never had much reason not to be. He introduced himself to the whole floor in the span of about 20 minutes, and by noon he'd learned most people's names, which in that office was something of a miracle. He learned Maeve's name, too. "You're the one keeping this whole operation from falling apart," he said, leaning against the edge of her desk like he'd been there 100 times. It wasn't a line. He'd been watching how the office ran for 2 hours, and he'd simply arrived at an accurate conclusion. "Someone has to," she said. He laughed. She noticed vaguely that it was a good laugh, genuine. She went back to her work. Ellis came back the next day to follow up on the access log review, and he stopped by her desk again. She helped him find the records he needed, the ones kept in a secondary archive that wasn't immediately obvious, and when they'd gone through the relevant files together, he said, "Do you want to grab lunch? I owe you for this." Maeve almost said no. She had sandwiches in the fridge and a 15-minute break and a call to return. She said yes. She wasn't entirely sure why. They ate at a place 2 blocks away, a small Italian spot with bad lighting and very good bread, and Ellis asked her how she'd ended up in the role, and she told him the short version, the version she'd gotten good at. Graduated early, needed income quickly, interviewed on a Thursday and had an offer by Saturday, and the work turned out to suit her. "Do you like it?" he asked. Nobody had asked her that in a long time. She had to actually think about it. "I like being good at something," she said finally. He nodded, like that was a real answer, which it was. She came back from lunch 12 minutes later than usual. It wasn't significant. There was nothing on the calendar that required her to be back at exactly noon, and the office ran fine in her absence because she'd set it up to run fine in her absence. That was the point. But when she stepped off the elevator, Ronan was standing at the entrance to the hallway, holding a folder, waiting for. She didn't know what he was waiting for. He turned when he heard the elevator open. He looked at her. Not the way he looked at the folders she flagged or the way he looked at his phone when a name he recognized came up. He looked at her the way he looked at things that required his full attention, and it only lasted a second, but she felt it land somewhere in her chest in a way she couldn't immediately explain.
Barton pushed back again. He said, "I'll call his assistant."
She moved past him toward her desk. She didn't look back. The next day he brought her coffee. She was at her desk at 7 as usual, working through the morning's correspondence. She heard footsteps, assumed it was the early cleaning crew making their final pass, and didn't look up until something was set down at the corner of her desk. A cup. Black. She looked up. Ronan was already walking toward his office. "The machine in the kitchen is broken," he said, not turning around. "I had someone bring some up. The machine wasn't broken." She knew because she'd made herself a cup from that same machine 30 minutes ago. She looked at the coffee. She looked at the empty hallway where he'd just been. She drank the coffee and went back to her work and told herself it was nothing. But things had started to shift, though she couldn't have said exactly when or how. He started stopping at her desk more. Not often, not enough that anyone would have flagged it, but more than before. He'd ask about things he'd normally handle through email. The status of a filing, the ETA on a delivery, small things that didn't actually require a conversation, things she'd have sent him a note about by midday anyway. She answered each time, same as she always had. Professional, efficient. She didn't read into it. What she noticed was that when Ellis came back for his third and final day of the audit, Ronan found 3 separate reasons to walk through the open floor. She noticed because he never walked through the open floor. He had a private hallway to his office, a route that bypassed the whole main space entirely. He used it every single morning and evening. She'd never once seen him deviate from it. He deviated from it 3 times on the day Ellis Ward was there. The last time she and Ellis were laughing. It was almost 5. Ellis had finished up his report, had come to say goodbye, and they were standing near the windows when he said something about the layout of the 42nd floor being the most illogical thing he'd ever seen in a commercial building, and she'd said, without thinking, that she'd said the exact same thing on her 3rd day and had spent the next week reorganizing it, and he'd said, "And they kept you?" And she'd said, they didn't have much choice, and something about the way she'd said it made him laugh, and then she was laughing too. She wasn't usually a person who laughed at work. She hadn't realized how much she'd forgotten what it felt like. Ronan passed through the floor on his way to somewhere. Somewhere that required him to walk past the windows. He stopped, briefly, the way you stop when something pulls your attention and you're not sure why. What? He looked at her. She saw it happen. The expression she'd learned to read in 2 years of watching his face, the one he wore when something required recalibrating, and then it was gone, and he kept walking. Ellis left at 5:15. He shook her hand. He said it was genuinely great to meet her. After he was gone, the office felt quieter than usual. The next morning was different. Not loudly different. Nothing about Ronan Dusk was ever loud. But she'd spent 2 years learning his patterns, the rhythms of his days, the precise ways his moods manifested in small behavioral shifts, and something had moved. He was already in the office when she arrived at 6:45. She could see his light on. That happened occasionally, when something overseas demanded early attention, so she didn't think much of it. She set up the morning, made the coffee, went through the calendar, prepared the first round of materials for the day. At 7:10 he appeared in his doorway, Maeve. He never used her name. He addressed things to her. Requests, corrections, forwarded messages, but he didn't use her name. She'd counted, privately, during her first year, once in 6 months. The second year it hadn't happened at all. She looked up. "There's a meeting Thursday with Aldrin Capital," he said. "I want a full background pull on their new managing partner. Someone named Forrest. I'll have it by Wednesday afternoon." He nodded. Didn't move back into his office. "The Barton contract, you flagged the clause in Section 7. "The indemnity language," she said. "It's broader than what was agreed in the term sheet. They've shifted the liability window. I noticed." He paused. "You noticed before I did." She didn't know what to say to that. She said, "I had more time to read it." He looked at her for a moment. Not the recalibrating look. Something else. Something she hadn't seen before, or hadn't let herself recognize before. "Take whatever time you need on the Aldrin file," he said. "Don't rush it." He went back into his office. Maeve sat at her desk and looked at the Barton contract and thought about nothing in particular for 60 seconds before she opened the next file and kept working. It was on a Thursday, Always Thursdays, apparently, that everything became impossible to ignore. There was a dinner, a business dinner, one of those that were also something else entirely, held at a private dining room on the 38th floor of a hotel, whose name was synonymous with the kind of money that didn't have to announce itself. Maeve wasn't invited. She was never invited to the dinners. She prepared the materials for them, briefed him on the attendees, anticipated the conversations he'd need to navigate, and then she went home. But she'd left her notebook. It was a small thing, a personal thing, not work-related exactly, but not unrelated either. She kept notes in it, the kind of shorthand observations about client patterns and contract language that she transcribed into the formal files in the morning. She didn't need it that night, but she went back for it because she was someone who didn't leave things behind. She took the stairs to avoid the main elevator bank, which let her out near the private dining room rather than the lobby. She wasn't going anywhere near the dinner. She was going to her desk, getting her notebook, leaving. She heard voices in the corridor outside the private room. She recognized the second one before she turned the corner. She stopped. Ronan was standing in the hall with a woman named Claire Sutton. She'd read the guest list. She always read the guest list. Who was with Aldrin Capital, and who was, by any reasonable assessment, the kind of beautiful that men like Ronan Dusk were supposed to end up with. Polished, composed, speaking with the easy fluency of someone who'd been in those rooms all her life. Maeve stood at the edge of the hallway, notebook in her hand, and felt something cold settle in her chest. She wasn't sure what she'd been expecting. Nothing, she would have said an hour ago. She hadn't been expecting anything. She turned around and took the stairs back down. She didn't sleep well. By 5 in the morning, she'd given up and made coffee in her kitchen and sat at the table with her mother's billing statements spread in front of her, not reading them, just needing something solid and specific to look at. This was the truth. She'd let herself start feeling something. She'd let the coffee and the name usage and the pauses in his doorway add up to something she hadn't intended to let them add up to. And now she was sitting in her kitchen at 5 in the morning feeling foolish about it. She was good at her job. She was the best he'd ever had, probably. She kept his world running. That was what she was. She went to work anyway. That was what you did. Ronan arrived at 8 instead of his usual 8:30, and when he saw her at her desk, already 2 hours in, already through the morning's correspondence, he stopped. "You're here early," he said. "I had work to do." She didn't look up. He was quiet for a moment. She felt it, the quality of it, the particular texture of a Ronan Dusk silence that was not empty. "The dinner ran late," he said. She typed something. Nothing, really, just keys. "I hope it was productive." "It wasn't." He paused. "I left early." Now she looked up. She couldn't help it. He was watching her with an expression she didn't have a category for. Not the calculating look, not the recalibrating look. Something direct and, strangely, uncertain, which was not a thing she associated with Ronan Dusk. "I found out you came back for something," he said. "Security logged the badge access. I forgot my notebook. You saw me in the hall." Silence. "Yes," she said. He moved closer, not all the way to her desk, just closer enough that she couldn't pretend the conversation was incidental. "Who was she?" she asked, before she could stop herself. "A contact," he said. "That's all she was." Maeve looked at him. She'd spent 2 years learning the difference between the versions of his voice. The one he used in meetings, which was smooth and carried no information beyond the surface. The one he used with people who were wasting his time, which was quieter and more precise. The one he used at the end of a long day, which had a different register entirely, lower and less guarded. He was using none of them now. "Maeve," he said. She waited. "I owe you an explanation." "You don't owe me anything," she said carefully. "I work for you." "That's not what I mean, and you know it." The office was empty, still early. The cleaning crew had been and gone, and the first of her colleagues wouldn't arrive for another 40 minutes. She said, "Say what you mean, then." He pulled a chair from the small table near her desk and sat in it, which was the most unexpected thing she'd ever seen him do, and she'd seen him do genuinely unexpected things. He sat in the chair and put his elbows on his knees and looked at her like he was figuring out how to say something he hadn't planned to say. "I ignored something for a long time, because it was easier," he said. "Because you were essential to me in a way I understood, and what I was starting to feel was something I didn't have a category for, and men like me don't do well with things we don't have categories for." She stared at him. "And then that man was there," he said, "and you were laughing, and I understood that I'd been." He stopped, careless. The word surprised her. She'd expected something harder, calculated, something about keeping things professional, not careless. "That's an interesting word for it," she said. "It's the accurate one." She looked at him, the man she'd spent 2 years learning to anticipate, to manage, to make space for, and she thought about her apartment and her mother's bills and the notebook she'd come back for and the expression on his face in the hotel corridor, the way it had looked from across the hall like something breaking open. "I need you to understand something," she said. He waited. "I'm not a problem you solve," she said. "I'm not a negotiation, and I'm not available to be noticed only when it's convenient for you or only because someone else happened to look my way, if that's what this is." "It isn't," he said. "How do I know that?" He was quiet, not the calculating quiet or the considering quiet, the one she hadn't ever heard from him or hadn't let herself hear, the one that was just, honest. "You don't," he said. "Not yet. That's the honest answer. I can tell you that I came in at 7 this morning because I wanted to be here when you arrived, and I've been sitting in my office for an hour trying to figure out how to say this, and that is probably the most undignified I've been in about a decade." But something shifted in his face. "You deserve the honest answer." Maeve looked at her desk, at the stacked folders she'd already organized, the annotated contracts, the calendar color-coded down to the quarter hour. She looked at him. "I'm going to keep doing my job," she said. "I know. Exactly the way I've always done it. I wouldn't want anything else." She picked up her notebook, opened it, found the page where she'd left off the night before. "There's a call at 9 with the Sorrento group," she said. "I've prepared a summary. It's on your desk." He stood, and then, quietly, with the kind of deliberateness she recognized as distinctly him, he said, "Thank you, Maeve." Not her role, not a task, her name. She didn't respond, and he didn't wait for her to. He walked back to his office and she went back to her work, and the city outside the windows was turning pale gold in the early light, and the whole office was quiet in a way that felt, for the first time, less like emptiness and more like possibility. She didn't know what came next. She was a person who liked to know what came next. But she picked up her pen and kept working, and she thought that for now, that was enough. More than enough. It was maybe exactly the right place to start.